Hi, my name is Allison, and I am presenting with Megan, Audrey, Kyle, and Crystal. We'll be discussing the impacts of clearcutting on Pacific Northwest forests. Beginning with a background on clearcutting, we find it important to ask why it has remained a popular logging technique despite its long history of controversy. For one, clearcutting is easily recognized as one of the most efficient logging methods when the focus is on a sustained profit. It allows operators to clear cut and replant an area and then sell the timber in the time it takes for it to regrow. Not only that, but allows increased safety for workers and extremely simplified planning for managers. Other arguments in support of clear cutting state that it mimics natural disturbance regimes like fire that increase available sunlight and reduce interspecific competition for target species like Douglas fir. There are many other supporting arguments, but from an industrial point of view, the convenience of clear cutting and its ability to provide a consistent source of profit is enough motivation to continue its use.
On the other hand, there are many reasons to use other logging methods. Namely, this presentation will go over the negative impacts of clear cutting on vegetation, riparian zones, and soil stability. Lastly, we will touch upon some ethical considerations before a discussion of alternative methods.
Vegetation plays an important role in forest ecosystems, from altering the hydrology through canopy cover to retaining nutrients necessary for healthy soils. In areas where clearcutting occurs, trees and other vegetation are uniformly cut down in large swaths. Removing essential canopy cover needed for intercepting precipitation during large rainfall events and shading ground cover leaves the soil both vulnerable to surface erosion and increases water's infiltration into the soil. With no protection, organic matter left behind during clear-cutting events decomposes as it warms up, which results in the loss of carbon. But nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus are released and left behind. In large clear cuts with no vegetation to take up these nutrients, rainfall events wash them into streams through surface erosion and cause nutrient loading. To continue, the lack of vegetation for water uptake and interception can exhaust the soil's saturation capacity and cause the soil to lose its cohesion, leading to potential landslides and in turn causing more nutrient loading and sedimentation into streams.
Clearcutting and landslides have a strong correlation with one another. Clearcutting is known to cause high levels of erosion, particularly on hill slopes, and this will eventually lead to landslide events occurring on these same hill slopes because of the weaknesses created from the erosion. Debris avalanche type of slides are often what occur shortly after the clearcutting of a steep slope. These are the type of landslides that most of us think of when seeing a large landslide send chunks of the hillside down with it, and are usually the slides that receive the most attention in the news. The binding action of roots from trees and vegetation can mechanically reinforce shallow soils via root fiber reinforcement. So after clearcutting occurs, the roots from the old trees begin to decay and soil regolith is lost. Soil regolith just refers to the ability of the soil to stay together and not crumble apart. This is one of the primary factors that keeps a hill slope together over time. Post-logging failure, which is usually in the form of landslides in regions where clearcutting has occurred, often happens near streams and rivers, something that many times spells disaster for the local and often wider-reaching ecosystems.
Considering the merits of clearcutting and all of the associated effects on soil, erosion, vegetation, and landslides, an additional consideration is the effect on wildlife. One area of concern is riparian zones, which are along the banks of streams. These areas have a high level of biodiversity due to the cool, moist conditions, complex habitat, and high productivity of plants. In the Pacific Northwest, these areas are home to 47 amphibian species that rely on the upland forest areas for their population structure and life cycle needs. Clearcutting too close to a riparian area can reduce stability, which increases sedimentation, water temperature, and leads to increased entry of wood and litter. While there are management recommendations of forestry reduction within these areas, the recommended buffer zone width varies significantly from 40 to 400 meters. This information must be used in conjunction with other presented research to inform mitigation and various alternative methods. Lastly, there are important ethical considerations when debating habitat removal and the relationship between humans and the environment.
The economic impacts from clearcutting are far-reaching. The impacts of logging, anywhere from clearcutting itself all the way to the landslides that result from it, can be looked at as the total cost that the action leads to, and this can be broken down into two categories: direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are those things that can be measured distinctly, such as damage to property and costs to clean up. Indirect costs are often much harder to estimate and can be things like relocation costs and the inability to use a piece of infrastructure further. These economic impacts can be detrimental to a local community and often impact larger regions for years to come. The economics of the practice of clearcutting itself affect many different people in a multitude of industries. For starters, the timber industry and their employment is the most direct impact. Clearcutting also leads to regional development, often boosting the economy of surrounding areas. The economic impacts from this whole process touches not only timber workers, but also those who work at lumber yards, paper mills, and much more. The entire consumer market for wood and paper products would take a huge hit in price shares if clearcutting ceased to happen. The long-term economic challenges that arise due to the practice of clearcutting are primarily due to its side effects. Things that clearcutting causes, such as reduced animal habitat and degraded water quality because of destroyed riparian buffer zones, negatively impact the economy. This is the case because over time, reduced environmental quality will lead to indirect costs, such as less human enjoyment of the outdoors in and around the area that has been clear-cut. While many of these long-term negative economic consequences are not felt until years after the clearcutting takes place, they can still be just as detrimental to the local economy as impacts felt immediately.
With the economic and ecologic impacts of clearcutting in mind, there have been many regulations that attempt to restrict its practice. The most relevant are the Forest Practices Acts in the U.S. These vary by state, but are generally structured to protect the ecosystem by limiting the size of clearcuts to around 50 hectares, prohibiting clearcuts on steep slopes, and establishing buffer zones around streams and highways. While this all sounds good in theory, the picture to the right shows how these regulations usually play out in reality. The forest practices rules are loosely enforced and have numerous exemptions, including being able to log on steep slopes like this one, as long as there is no human infrastructure in the path of a possible landslide, and the landowner determines there is an acceptable level of risk in the area. Third-party certification systems, like the FSC and SFI, have attempted to fill in these gaps left by state regulations. While these were meant to incentivize more sustainable practices, and have been successful for many other techniques, they have little to no impact on clearcutting in the Pacific Northwest. These regulations place a focus on limiting the size of clearcuts and requiring more snags and legacy trees, but most of the requirements are no different than the ones already set forward by the states. As a result, clearcuts are being perpetuated since operators are able to get the same profit from getting certified and selling their timber at steeper prices without having to make any real change.
Many of the values lumber industries have, such as economic gain through forest products and employment, are anthropocentrically centered as they derive value from the forest based off of what it can provide for humans, instead of based on its own intrinsic value. By viewing the forest as a commodity, we see it as valuable only for human consumption. For example, if we found that clearcutting in particular was no longer providing jobs or economic benefits, then we would stop the practice. Specifically, if the degradation of riparian zones and soil stability cause problems for industries that humans have placed value on, such as fisheries, then trees, soil, and streams would be considered. Unfortunately, this consideration would cause them to be a means to an end of protecting human interests. The negative environmental consequences of clearcutting have already been presented, and there ought to be more moral considerability for the aspects of the environment for their own right. In order to encompass the largest number of entities, ranging from trees, soil, wildlife, and the land itself, we see ecocentrism as the most holistic approach. This would encourage humans to recognize and consider the needs and well-being of the entire ecosystem community. While it is difficult to implement ecocentric practices into current policies and land management, mitigation strategies and alternative methods make steps in the right direction for the inclusive consideration of the nature community in its own right.
As we've learned, logging companies often operate to maximize their profit, and clearcutting can often be seen as an inevitable factor. We aim to research techniques logging companies can use to mitigate the impacts of clear-cut harvesting events. Retaining understory vegetation, as you can see in the picture on the top right, can play a key role in reducing the size and volume of landslides created by the methods used with clearcutting. The graph on the bottom right displays a comparison of simulated landslide volumes for areas with and without understory vegetation for clearcuts and partial cuts. The gray bars indicate destruction
of understory vegetation, and the white bars indicate a retention of understory vegetation. Maintaining understory vegetation proved to be more effective in reducing landslide volume after harvesting. Slope stability simulations for various vegetation management practices indicate that clearcuts produce the least stable conditions due to root decay after harvesting, and using this method can allow for proper road placement and regions to avoid. As trees mature, they sequester atmospheric carbon and fuel the soil. When clearcutting events take place, this source is lost. The integration of silvopasture in clearcut areas can reduce this impact. Silvopasture is categorized with the inhabitants of trees alongside the use of pasture components supporting grazing animals. Cattle produce manure which directly adds carbon to the topsoil. This maximizes the resource allocation of the land, along with providing logging companies with an alternative source of income. As we've learned about the impacts clearcutting has had on the ecosystem as a whole, we aim to find alternative methods logging companies can practice. Helicopter logging, as seen in the picture on the left, is an effective method to use in environmentally sensitive regions. It reduces soil disturbances, minimizes sediment in streams, and eliminates the use of roads, a leading factor producing landslides. This method must be evaluated and used properly as it is both costly and risky. Thinning is another method that aims at removing slower growing or defective trees, providing more space for the remaining stands to grow. This directly increases the availability of water and soil nutrients to the remaining stands, resulting in larger and healthier trees. Lastly, the most feasible option that logging companies can incorporate is the use of variable retention harvesting, seen in the figure on the bottom. This method aims at mimicking natural disturbances, such as fires. VRH provides large patches to maintain species diversity of both flora and fauna while connecting strips are harvested. VRH requires standard equipment that is commonly used and would not likely cost logging companies more.
The continued use of clearcutting places profit above the health of the ecosystem, upsetting the balance between the environment, economic gain, and socially accepted practices. This poses a serious risk to the sustainability of our forests. We therefore encourage companies to abandon clearcutting and introduce more selective harvesting methods, like variable retention harvesting. Keeping in mind the difficult economic feasibility for many large-scale companies, our final recommendation is a proposed amendment to the Forest Practices Act that would require clearcutting operations to implement enhanced mitigation methods to reduce their impact on the environment. These methods are low cost but high impact. The amendment would include minimum riparian buffers of 25 linear meters, required slope analysis by geological engineers to assess landslide risk, and increased retention of understory vegetation. In completing these requirements, a more sustainable forest practice can be maintained.